Hello and welcome to On the Kerbs Pub Chat. I'm your host, Thiemo Albers-Daly, and joining me down the local for a drink or two is none other than Motorsport Journalist Öykü Ceylan. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm really excited to talk about what we're going to talk about today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And yeah, I'm excited as well because, as is the kind of theme with this podcast, we choose a different topic each week. We just kind of delve right into it. And we're here today to chat about Formula One and motorsport more generally through the lens of sports washing, sustainability, and environmentalism in a broader context. So before we get into all that, though, I do want to know what first got you interested in motorsport and how's today's topic fed into that, if at all.
Yeah, so long story short, I got into motorsports through Drive to Survive. And since 2020, I've been following the Formula One seasons religiously. And I hit a threshold of content consumption that made me feel like I can create content of my own. And I started thinking about what I should create on. Then came the idea of combining two of my passions, one being motorsports and the second one being sustainability. And at the first glance, they might not seem too interconnected with each other, but they are far more connected than we think they are. And I just like to write about them, talk about them. And today's topic definitely feeds into it a lot because it's sports washing. It's one of the giant pillars of sustainability that maybe we don't necessarily think about when we say sustainability. So I'm just really excited to discuss more in depth what's really going on behind those fast cars that we all love and flashy races and their not so glamorous sides.
Oh, definitely. And sustainability is something that I've touched on a little bit before with Jacob in terms of the calendar back in our first episode of this series. So it's going to be interesting to get a little bit more into that and a bit more into the sports washing side of it, as you say, because they all kind of feed into it. And the one thing I've noticed from my various pub chats so far is that as different the topics are, they all do kind of interrelate and feed each other into a little bit. So it's going to be quite interesting. But this is more your area of expertise, as you hinted at a little bit, and I'm not taking the reins as much for this one. I'm very much in a learning kind of capacity today, so I'm going to sit back and sip my drink a little bit, and you can just go straight into introducing what sports washing is for those people that don't know, because again, I feel like it's a term that it's been around for a few years, but not a lot of people might really know about it unless they're up to date with that side of things. So talk about that and its emphasis with F1 and school me appropriately.
Yeah, okay. So sports washing is when governments and big companies like the FIA or Formula One use sports to make themselves look good and hide their not so great actions. They do this by sponsoring sports events, supporting teams, or being associated with famous athletes to create a positive image. Sports have this magical power to get people excited and bring everyone together, which I want to talk about later more in detail. So it's a perfect tool for those who want to push their own agenda and make people forget about the abusive or oppressive stuff that they've done. And what you said about it being around only recently, like we've been hearing the term sports washing since 2015. It was first defined as sports washing back then.
That only seems like a few years ago to me, though. So that's why I say I'm still in denial about how time works.
Yeah. Almost 10 years now, but it's okay. It's relatively new when you think about the history of languages. It was defined by Fred Shapiro as the strategic use of sports to improve a country or organization's image while deflecting attention from their wrongdoings. But then it's not a new trick in the playbook. It's been around for centuries, and some notable historical figures used it way back then, like Alexander the Great, for instance. He was a master of using sporting events like the Olympic Games, and fast forward to a much darker chapter in history, Hitler did it back in 1936 with the Berlin Olympics, which was all of a start to gain international approval. So yeah, from the ancient times to now in the modern era of Formula One, and I never thought that I would be using Hitler and Formula One within the same paragraph or same speech, but
it does get us into a bit of a grey
that.
area, and we're definitely not saying they're as bad as Hitler. We're going to stress that now. But it's just, again, it's an interesting tactic that's evolved a lot throughout the years, and obviously has been used by a lot of shady kind of people. So it's disappointing in some ways that we are relating it to Formula One as a whole, because you see global motorsport and you think that it's the pinnacle for a reason, and it wouldn't necessarily have. We're not naive enough to think that it's all sunshine and rainbows, but you wouldn't necessarily expect these sort of dark elements to get in there a bit.
Yeah. I mean, but I feel like definitely there are some people among the fans of motorsports that are naive enough to think it's all sunshine and rainbows. Like when you talk about issues like sexism, racism, or sports washing.
Well, this is where the first kind of counter argument that I want to bring into it is, just to see what you've got to say on it, is because obviously we go to certain countries and the human rights record is one of the questionable things, like you say, but you bring the sport there, and that's kind of, it's not overlooked, but it's kind of pushed to one side in the name of, oh, look at how great this thing is instead. And the argument that F1 has made for going there is that it's better to include them in the conversation with the hope of showing them an alternative route to being more open to other ideas and to going away from these kind of darker periods of that country's history, rather than just ignoring them entirely and leaving out people in the dark, as it were, and just saying, oh, you're either with us or against us, and make this a very black and white issue, which obviously it's not. I do have another thing for that, but I want to see what your kind of approach with sports washing is in response to that.
Well, it's challenging because I don't think there is necessarily an objectively right or wrong stance to it. But I feel like, of course, we shouldn't exclude them from the conversation, but they should at least provide a basic level of human rights and activism enough to be included in the talks. Because, for instance, Qatar or Bahrain, these are places most of the Western people would never visit if it wasn't for the big sports organizations that are being held there. And just because there are sports tourism going on around those regions, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting any better when it comes to women's rights or LGBTQ rights or anything like that, environmental rights. If I have been seeing a progression when it comes to these matters that we were fighting for, maybe I would agree more with your point. But then to say that, oh, we just want to include them into the conversation, they don't even care about the conversation. They just want to distract you from it.
No, I take your point there. It does come across sometimes as we want to include them in the conversation, but in terms of then backing the conversation up with action, we saw it a lot with Sebastian Vettel within the sport, and then Lewis, obviously, in the last few years in particular. The action to back it up then has not really materialized an awful lot, or anywhere near as much as we would have hoped for what a lot of fans, both new and old, would constitute as the bare minimum. And it's this kind of thing, oh yeah, we'll say we'll do this, but then it's kind of, but when are you actually going to do that? And then another counter argument for countries like the ones you mentioned would be that if we're using human rights as the main kind of topic of contention there, you're pretty hard pressed to look at anywhere on the F1 calendar then that doesn't have some kind of flaw within it on a moral or legal standpoint, especially if you look a little bit into recent history. You take some of the possibly controversial countries that you put in there, like the United States is the obvious example there of, there are issues there, but it obviously gets people in a lot more murky and uncomfortable water, because that's where more of them are, especially with the Drive to Survive fans being predominantly from America, it's probably fair to say. And it muddies the waters to a point where people then don't want to have that conversation at all. And sports washing then kind of gets thrown out as this thing. It's only done over there. It's not possibly done over here. And it's this whole trying to be black and white situation again, which just doesn't apply, and it can't really be there. And it kind of, makes the sports washing seem even more appealing in some ways, because as I think you wanted to go on to say a little bit, the appeal of sports washing is just the magic of sport. You're distracted by this really popular, pretty thing that entertains you, and you're not really focusing then on what the bigger issues are.
Yeah. I mean, all true. It's definitely wrong to say that it's just specific to maybe the Arabic countries or the eastern part of the world. Definitely America is in it, Europe is in it. But then when you get into it, it just turns into this political and morally based conversation that every country has its rights and its wrongs. But I think when it comes to sports washing specifically, for instance, USA doesn't have to sports wash people by Formula One Grand Prix, because there are so many sport tournaments that are going on there. And also in the UK or Europe or Russia or China, they all have their own sports with, I mean, these are big spectator sports also. They have this audience, masses that are going to see the sport. But I think when you talk about maybe Bahrain, not necessarily anything is happening out there when it comes to sports. It's just they have the World Cup, which is not even theirs. I'm not even sure if they have their own national team on the World Cup. They don't have a Formula One team. I mean, not every country on the calendar has their own teams anyways. But do you get my point of view? Like, why are you specifically getting this sports to come to your country while you're not even really into sports at all, and neither are your citizens? You know?
Yeah, it'd be one thing where if you take South America as an example, there is a lot of appetite for motorsport, and there is an attempt at growing the grassroots upwards to improve it, and so that more drivers can get through, because we have seen drivers in the recent past in F1 from there, and we see a few in the feeder series now in other categories. And so it makes sense if there was investment there, because you see there's a popularity for it. There's a hunger for younger generations to get involved, either in the karting sense or in other respects, such as mechanics, PR, whatever. Whereas, like you say, that might be the case in some of those other countries, but it doesn't seem as obvious, and it doesn't come across as being as visible as it would be there. And maybe, if I'm being a little bit naive, but wanting to try and be fair with everything, maybe we've just missed all that. Maybe it's out there and we've just somehow, it's been filtered out and we've not noticed it. However, I feel like that might not be the case.
Yeah, I don't think, like Saudi Arabia, again, because these are the two prime examples, like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. I don't think they're having this Grand Prix just because they want to set a good example for the upcoming generations. They just want us to Google Bahrain, and they want Aston Martin images to come up, Max Verstappen images to come up. They don't want people who are being brutally killed or being given death penalties just because they're gay. And I just feel like maybe I'm a bit too harsh here, with opposed to your naive.
I always attempt to be the diplomat. That's all I try to do. I try and see both sides of it, but I'm happy for you to speak your mind.
Yes, so I think it's just a big amount of manipulation that goes into it, especially with the governments being involved. But I don't want to sound like this big conspiracy theorist. I would love to believe that they're doing it for all the good reasons, but it's just
it's really interesting as well for me to compare and contrast a little bit more. This year, we'll have 4 races in the Middle East: Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi. 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom end of the calendar. And for contrast, we'll have 3 in the US with Miami, Austin, and Las Vegas. And it does seem that if you would label sports washing to be on the Middle Eastern side of it, it's not sports washing on the US side of it necessarily, but it still doesn't seem like it's being done for the genuine purpose of just fans. It's kind of, there's another element there, which is probably money. It's particularly in Las Vegas. It doesn't seem like that's being done for any other reason, despite what's being said officially. It's just, here's an excellent way for F1 to capitalize on making a lot of money, which it has every right to do. But for an organization,
it has been working great.
But for an organization that says it's always putting and wanting to put the fans first, it's interesting where we then end up going where these fans supposedly are. Because if you take Zandvoort, that makes sense. Max Verstappen, there's a lot of fans there. It's a shame that the track isn't probably better utilised because of the cars that we have. So the racing isn't particularly the best, but that's a different matter entirely. But that makes sense, at least on a base level. You've got a Dutch world champion. You've got, before then, a Dutch driver who's looking very strong. Let's put a Grand Prix there. Makes sense. Same with Checo and Mexico. Makes sense. But then there's some of the other places where you're like, there isn't even a driver from any of those four countries. There's not even an American driver on the grid. We've got Haas as a team, but I don't know if they're the best poster child for an American motorsport thing at the moment. Hopefully when Andretti come in, that's going to be a better advertisement for it. And it just seems a little, like I was saying, the waters are really muddied there. And it's interesting how, in some ways, and maybe this is me with my conspiracy hat on slightly, America can deflect their attention because they've got these other races on the calendar where, like, but they're doing it for worse reasons. So look at them. But also, we're still not going to get rid of them off the calendar.
Yeah, I mean, but
I say this like I'm expecting you to have an answer to any of this and just expect you to solve it.
Yeah.
Very much casual pub chat that's got very heated because we've had a couple of shots already.
Yeah, happens to us, doesn't it? Yeah, no, I think, but then we have to remember that fans of the sport are a big stakeholders of the sport. And when you have 3 races in the US, after you have released Drive to Survive and gained like this big following from there, it's not all that nonsense because they're profiting from their crazy. Also from Qatar because the governments are paying them. But not the fans necessarily. I don't think not many of the Formula One fans are like, oh my God, let's go have a race in that region of the world. They're just going there because the races are being held there. It's not public demand that...
It's also interesting where they're spending the money, because if we take America, for example, to Miami in particular as the one race we've had so far there, it obviously was a very expensive weekend if you wanted to go there for the full weekend, never mind if it was just one day. And I've heard from various people who were there at the Grand Prix that the transport to and from the place, unless you were there with yourself with a car or something, if you wanted some kind of public transport or a shuttle bus or anything, good luck. It was very much, and you think this is some kind of basic thing you would need to have in place there for health, safety, security, and just general good organisation and management from a Grand Prix venue holder. Silverstone, for example, know that they're going to be absolutely swamped every year and have shuttles from the train stations, bus stations accordingly, so that they can try and minimise the chaos. Everyone knows they're going to have to queue for hours, but at least you can get there. Whereas with somewhere like Miami, it's kind of not quite tumbleweed, but it's that kind of side of things. And again, it's this weird thing of, oh yeah, the fans want a third race in America, we're going to do it here, but but what are you spending the money on to make sure that everyone has a great time because you are prioritizing the fans? So it's this weird thing of, again, it's not sports washing, but it feels related to, because if you start tackling one area of it, you've got to look at the others, and then you see who's doing a good job of it, who's doing not a sports washing job of it, but also a questionable job of it, and it just gets into this muddy water, and we end up having a more intense conversation a lot quicker than we thought we were going to.
Yeah. And also people having to commute to the Miami Grand Prix with their own vehicles. Like, how sustainable is that? FIA, I'm asking you. Like, that's also really, from an organizational part, that's a disaster, but also from a sustainability point of view, that's even more disastrous, I think, in my opinion.
Well, that's something you wanted to speak a bit more on, was the FIA's stance on this and analysing kind of F1 and the FIA's pledge to carbon neutrality and their environmental pledges a bit more widely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think this is the biggest plot twist in this topic, because Formula
One... That's saying something already.
Yeah, they're all about sustainability now, and they wear this as a badge of honor, how they want to reach carbon zero when it comes to 2030. They've got these ambitious plans, but then they're giving contract extensions to countries like Bahrain or Abu Dhabi, which doesn't exactly have the cleanest environmental values or human rights records. So I feel like something is just not adding up there. And
all of this also done with the guise of We Races One, which we've not actually seen anywhere since the end of 2021.
Yeah, I was also going to say that the placement of these races on the calendar, top two and the last two, these are where we are super excited because the season has just started. We have had a long winter break and we just cannot get enough of Formula One. And the bottom two, which is the end of a season. So not even some races in the middle, in the summer season. I mean, also because those countries are really hot and you should have them in the winter. I get it. You cannot have a race in Bahrain in July. But I feel like that's a bit sketchy to have the first two and the last two there.
Well, this was also something that Jacob and I touched upon in our calendar chat, was they've obviously made some changes for 2024 for the calendar in terms of trying to regionalise a bit. But again, it seems kind of a half-cocked idea with it and not completely thought through as well as it could be. And one of the things we were talking about was that if you have to start in the Middle East and end in the Middle East, at least then progress around the globe accordingly, one way or the other. Whereas this way, it seems that they're doing Bahrain and Saudi, nip down to Australia, do China, Japan, and then all the way back over to Europe. Surely it would make more sense to then go over to America or just start Bahrain and say, move through to Baku, go to Europe, and then go across the Americas that way, and so on and so forth. But there's still a lot of toing and froing, and it doesn't seem like a natural progression there. And as you say, do we need 4 races over there? Do we need them in their calendar placements? Could we not do something like Australia, China, Japan, and then do a couple in the Middle East? Because even if you still fly back there for the end of the season, one big flyback at the end of the year is still a lot better than what the current format is. So it seems a little bit out of sorts on that one. And again, it's like you're saying, the whole thing with trying to be carbon neutral by 2030. There's definitely ways that they can do that, and I'm not saying that it has to be a rotational thing around the globe, but it does seem that they're trying to keep everyone happy, and that never works.
Yeah. I mean, I also understand that there are a lot more than just geographic planning that goes into constructing the calendars. But then I think they can optimize it far better. Maybe one full round might not be super feasible when you think about all the transportation and the governments and the people and the country schedules and everything. So I think they cannot just be like, okay, we want to have one full circle and that's it.
But you could still try and aspire to get as close as possible. I mean, if you look at the May calendar for next year, May, June roughly, you have, I think it's Imola, Monaco, which fine, then Canada, then back over to Spain. It's like, why are we going to Canada in the middle of the European season? Just add that on after you've gone to Miami. You know, it's I'm sure, because there's obviously a lot of money involved in the placement of these venues on the calendar anyway. I'm sure you can work out a deal where someone gets enough money that they can move this Grand Prix to a few weeks earlier in the year if they really wanted it to. And especially somewhere, if we take Montreal as the example there, where the track itself is not it's in the city, but it's separated from the rest of the city. It's on its own island. It's not going to bother the traffic there as much. So it's going to be congested regardless of when you do it. So what is the harm with tying it nicely in with Miami? It's less of a hassle there. But this does come back to something you actually did want to talk about a bit more, which was then, if we're having this conversation down our kind of digital pub and we're having a good drink about it, fans and activists, how do we come into it, and how do we actually go from not just sounding like we're moaning about it all and just blaming everything and not having a concrete solution? What can we actually do you think?
Yeah, I think we can do a lot because, again, it's really important to remember that we are the stakeholders of this sport, so our voices do matter. I think the calendar optimization from last year to this year, eventually they had to optimize it, but I think the way they acted so quick about it is because of this fuss that went around on TikTok, on Twitter, social media in general. the fans were being awoke about it. They were demanding the calendar to be more optimized when it comes to carbon emissions. So the FIA knew that they had to take action better sooner than later. And when it comes to sports washing, I feel exactly the same. What concerns me is that I think the fans are not really aware of it. Because when it comes to the countries that have Grand Prix in the Middle East, there is still a lot of people going to those races. And that's just scary to me because, say, for instance, your girlfriend wouldn't be there having the best time of her life because she wouldn't be able to dress whatever she feels like or act whatever she feels like. Or if you're a gay couple, you could be punished by death. But then just because you want to see another Max Verstappen win, you fly to Qatar. Like, oh, what about it? I just don't get it. I think I'm a bit angry, so to speak, to the fans as well, because I expect more and more awareness from people when it comes to issues like that.
I think it goes back a bit on what Lewis was having trouble with during 2020, 2021. It was this whole idea of, yes, it's very nice that you're standing up for all of these issues and everything, but why is it our problem? We're just here to watch a sport that we just want to be entertained on the weekend. We shouldn't have to get involved in any of these things. And you can understand that to a degree, but it's also, but at what point does it have to get before you do think is it not easier for you to just get involved? We can try and sort this all out a lot sooner, and then you can actually go back to enjoying your sport on a Sunday without having to worry about anything else. But again, it's trying to get over that initial hump of making everyone aware, maybe somehow convincing Netflix to do an episode on a serious episode on these kind of issues for Drive to Survive, and say, look, we couldn't, there wasn't any Haas drama this year, so we can't have an episode on that. So we're going to do an episode on something serious instead. Obviously, with Nico Hülkenberg's hair, they do have enough now for a full episode on just that alone, so that doesn't really matter. But they could, it's an easier solution, or even Formula One itself could try and have some kind of self-criticism on its own social media channels and try and just open it up a bit. I mean, you saw with the More Than Equal survey that they did that it was open for a long time, this survey, trying to get as many respondents as possible so that they could have a good, long, hard look at the motorsport world from the people that it supposedly represents and what they can do to improve on that. And you see a lot of that with grassroots initiatives as well. So why is F1 kind of not immune to that, but when it does that, it kind of like, okay, we changed the calendar. Look at this massive change we made. And then you look at the calendar and you think, well, it's not actually that big. It's, you've said, is this good enough? And hopefully you'll say yes and we can get away with it and leave it there. Because if you say no, like, fine, now we have to go and do more on this. And it seems this thing that we do have to hold them to account, which is really frustrating because we just want to enjoy the racing. We don't want to have to get involved in this. But it's one of these things that if you actually, it's just one of those pain in the ass things where you have to get involved because the alternative is just letting them get away with it. And that doesn't really stick for anyone and doesn't help anyone. And certainly doesn't mean that you're going to get to enjoy your sport on a Sunday any quicker.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're going to those Grand Prix, you're getting involved anyways. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to fly there.
Well, it's one of those things. It's one of those indirect participation things. You don't realize how involved you are by doing these things. You just assume you're going to watch a race.
Yeah, true. When you're in the comfort of your own house, it's just maybe harder to perceive the importanceness of.
Or even if you're flying out to a Grand Prix, you're just so focused on, I'm here to have a nice time. I'm not thinking about my involuntary participation in this bigger cog of systems that I'm getting involved in there. So you're just, again, it's trying to change that mentality slightly to make people more aware of it.
Yeah, but is it bad that I expect people to be more smart? Like, come on, people. Yeah, it's just, yeah, no, I don't want to be mean.
That might be a separate conversation, but yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's what you said about Drive to Survive having an episode on these topics that we should really talk about. I think they would rather have an episode on Nico Hülkenberg hair, for sure. But then I feel like we're in this grey zone of people not knowing whether they should talk about it or not. Because I imagine Netflix having this episode dedicated to talking about sports washing, while the FIA still has these countries on the calendar, it can backlash or it can go really great, and people can.
I suppose it depends on how they do it, and you need this middle ground. I mean, it does seem curious to me that they haven't yet done, and for as far as I know, aren't planning to do an episode on anything like this, but they'll happily give an entire episode to Nikita Mazepin in the 2022 season, who absolutely did not deserve a 40-minute episode of airtime dedicated to himself. So it's this kind of, with you need that balance, and I think that's the important thing there. And I think as long as you're trying to make steps in that direction, and that is the one thing good that I will be able to say on F1 here, is like at least they did make some changes to the calendar and showing they're willing to have that conversation, listen, and start to compromise. Because it's, as much as we'd like it to all happen in one fell swoop, it's not going to. But as long as we can keep moving in the right direction, then everyone's kind of working together on that one. And it's kind of, yeah, we're not saying you have to make this massive expose Netflix documentary. You've got enough of those as it is on everything else. But would it hurt to maybe just, this isn't great, we should maybe point that out slightly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would love to see them do that, but I don't think it's happening anytime soon, really.
We'll have to start a petition. That's the old-fashioned way of doing it. We'll get some flyers out, we'll get a petition set up.
Yeah.
You can come down to the town hall and you can sign it in person.
Yeah, no, but I think it's still a big step, like, for us to be here talking about it, and for all the people tuning in and listening to it, at least having an idea of what's going on, because maybe...
And that's part of it, you know, as just listening to it.
Yeah, just being informed about it, and then the next time you're watching the season finale, like the last Grand Prix of the season, you just think about it, you know, you're not at this comfort zone anymore. And I'm
so, like you're saying, it's one of those things where F1 and the wider motorsport community, they've proven that they're willing to listen, and it's interesting how in other motorsports as well they do seem to listen a bit more, and they don't. I mean, Formula E, for example, they have some issues, don't get me wrong, but they diversify their calendar a lot. They kind of cater to the fan base a little bit. They try and create these opportunities, and it doesn't seem that there's, and again, maybe this is me being naive and just not knowing enough about what goes on behind the scenes, but it doesn't seem as that there's some bloke with a cat stroking it in the background, plotting some things about what to do with the calendar for the following year. It just kind of seems very fluid and very natural and very easy come, easy go. And we're going to try it here, but we don't necessarily have to go back there. We'll see what the fans say. We'll listen to them about stuff on track and off track. And Extreme obviously has a very environmental approach to it, because it's part of the cornerstone of that series. And even if you look at Nitrocross, it's one of the things where it had a global calendar last year. It's taking it back to America this year. It's still a world championship in that classic American way of, it's a world championship, but it's only in America. But again, it's this kind of, maybe the environmental aspect wasn't the top thing on its list for reasoning to do it, but it's interesting how Saudi Arabia was on their original calendar for the 2022-2023 season, but they didn't actually go there in the end. And we're still not 100% across why, because there must have been some exploratory talks about that. Otherwise, it would never have appeared there. So it's interesting to see these things happen, but then F1 doesn't seem to move as quickly as we would hope it to. But at the same time, as you pointed out, we as fans, we've managed to get them to listen on the calendar side of things and show that the voices matter. And okay, it's not as much progress as you would wanted, but it's like having to deal with a politician. You know, if you're going to ask for X, you'll maybe get half of X. And then you have to come back and figure out another way to get X, but then Y will come up and you might have to do that for someone else. And it's this whole thing. There is a balance to it, but it's quite easy to get disheartened by it all, I think. And that probably explains some of your anger, which isn't misplaced, to be fair, but it's annoying, because I think if this was purely a political thing, if this was just a human rights thing by itself, then go for it. But this is all impacting a sport that we all just want to watch on a Sunday, on a Saturday, and just relax from and take a break from having to deal with all of that stuff the rest of the time. So it's frustrating that those two words kind of come together in such a negative way at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I feel like more and more expecting a solid environmentalist strategy from the FIA that would make me satisfied is even worse than expecting a good tyre strategy from Ferrari on a
You
Sunday.
hadn't even finished a sentence and I knew where that was going.
Yeah, it's just so bad. But I mean, just a quick note about Formula E here. I think it's a bit unfair and tricky to compare Formula One and Formula E because, first of all, Formula One has been around for so long, and they're just now trying to incorporate the elements of sustainability into the sports. And some fans do not even like that. I mean, there are some people who are not tuning into Formula E races because the cars don't have this sound that they wish the cars had, you know. And Formula E is just straight up built around this core values of sustainability. So it's really hard to have a solid ground and then put something on top of it that doesn't really fit. And having this core values in your basis from the very beginning. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to the FIA and Formula One, they could do better, obviously. But then
So
Formula,
I agree with what you're saying, but to go back to how annoying time is at the moment, it's going to be its 10th year next year already for Formula E. It'll have been around for a decade. And not saying that everyone has to copy paste it, but it's curious that you'd think maybe it would look at it and go, we could take that element from it though and try and incorporate these little bits and pieces. No one's saying you have to copy and paste it, but it's just maybe you take something a little bit like Pawtucket Brewery in Family Guy. It's inspired by Duff in The Simpsons, but it's basically the same thing. But we're just going to borrow this idea and we're going to use it over here, and maybe it works out really nicely for us as well. And I think it's this weird thing of you don't all have to be in competition with each other. You can all thrive, but maybe you can learn a thing or two from each other at the same time. But that doesn't seem to always compute, or it goes on a base level, they accept that. But then when it comes to doing that, it's a different matter entirely. But I feel like we are straying slightly off the beaten path because we did try and focus solely on sports washing. I feel like we went in just down a rabbit hole a little bit and threw some cabins along the way, which I'm totally fine with. That's what happens in a pub chat. But it just shows the complexity of this, and I think that sports washing, it feels like it's the biggest, not the biggest thing, but it seems like the first mole that comes up in whack-a-mole. But once you've hit that, then you've got to make sure that it stays down. But then what else is popping up as a result of that one going down there, and how do you best deal with all of that? Unless you've got like 4 arms and hammers in each one.
Yeah, it never ends. You cannot just be like, oh, these 4 countries are doing sports washing, let's don't have races in them. Problem solved. If it was that easy, I think they would be taking action.
If that solved the problem as well in those countries that we're having the issues with in the first place, then gosh darn, we should have done that already. I didn't know it was that easy. And I think that's what annoys a lot of people as well, that maybe if they're new to this whole concept, these whole ideas, like, oh, we shouldn't race there. Like, why don't we just not race there? I was like, because that doesn't actually solve the problem. We've opened this can of worms by going there in the first place. Now we've got to deal with it. We can't ignore it. And that goes for literally everywhere. And the more races you add, the bigger that problem becomes, because each country will have its own unique problems with it. Some of them will be a lot easier to deal with than others. But that doesn't mean you can then go, look, we did a great job over here. Like, yeah, you did. Now sort this one out. And then sort this one out. Yeah. But I don't want to get all negative about it before we finish this off. So I'll hand it back to you. Do you have any optimism for us at the end?
I do, definitely. I mean,
that was convincing. Do you want to say that again?
No. No, it's going to be okay in like 25 years of time. No, I think we're going to get to a place.
Alonso's going for his 3rd title still.
Yeah. 33, baby. Yeah, no, it's going to be good. We have to give it time, and people are going to be more aware. And I think with the dedication to be carbon neutral by 2030, they're going to focus more on sustainability in the upcoming seasons. At least that's what I'm hoping. And again, I said this in this episode so many times, but I think we as the spectators sometimes neglect our power that we have in the sport. But the whole reason that Formula One stands today is because we watch it. So it's just, I love talking about it. I love the fact that we just sat down here today in this pub and talked about it for an hour. And yeah, I think these are the small bits and pieces that's gonna change some bigger stuff in the near future, I feel like. So not super pessimistic. I still have faith.
Well, if that doesn't warm your heart, then you need another beer and you should go and get one, because that would definitely do it. That is all we're going to talk about on that front today, because I feel like this could go on for quite a while if we're not careful. And maybe we'll save that for a pub in real life and many more drinks where we'll see what actually happens then in terms of do we have some kind of brainwave and come up with this magic solution for how to deal with all of this. But in the meantime, where people can find us away from this pub can be found in the description below, so do go and check all of that out and let us know what your thoughts are in the comments and on socials when we promote this episode. We would love to hear what solutions you have for all of that. In the meantime, do you fancy going to get another pint?
Yeah, for sure. I do. I need one.
Right. Well, we're going to go and do that. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you again very soon.